to my Crochet 101 series. Today we're going to be going over crochet garments. Now with this video, I hope to provide a guide to creating your own crochet garments. It's going to be concise and it's not going to necessarily be going into everything in depth, but I do hope that I give you a general framework and that after watching this, you're just a little bit more confident in going into making garments. Now, it's important we first go over the actual definition of what a garment is. With a quick Google search, you'll find this definition, which is essentially noting it as any item of clothing. So this could be anything that you can wear on your body, but as an extension, some people will also include like accessories as well as things like dishcloths. So the definition can definitely be a little bit more fluid or a little bit more narrow, but I just wanted to make sure that we're on sort of like the same page before we're going into this conversation. This I call the need to know info guide, and this is just like a little shortened sort of summarized version of everything that we're going to be going into today. So like a 1, 2, 3 sort of guide. We start with supplies. So of course it's going to include your medium, so yarn, as well as, your main tool, which would be crochet hooks, but you also have those other assisting supplies that are very important, I think, to the process. Next up, we have techniques. Now, I've mentioned this several times, but before going into making really anything, ensure that you know the beginner stitches. At minimum, I feel like that's the thing that you should 100% know out of this whole list of techniques that I'm going to include. Do also know, however, joining things like weaving and ends as well as blocking, which I will get into later down the line. Next up, we have the what, and that's going to be like essentially asking, what are we making? Before you go into making anything, especially garments, you really need to have a sort of plan, and it's important whether you're going off of a pattern and knowing, okay, I need this yarn, I need these tools, I need these skills, or even if you're freehanding, I still think go in with a sort of framework in mind of like, I'm trying to make this garment, here's the method that I'm going to use to make it. So just have a plan is essentially what I would summarize that as. Next up, we have measurements, which are very important into knowing. Again, it doesn't matter whether you're freehanding or if you have a pattern, measurements are going to be extremely important. And oftentimes, whenever you're going into making something, and let's say, for instance, in this example, we're using a pattern, the designer will include a section that's like, hey, this is what if you go by the gauge and everything like that, here's what the finished measurements will be based on whatever size. So that's why it's extremely important for you in particular to sort of note your measurements so that going into it, okay, here's how this is going to fit, or here's what set of instructions I need to follow to get this fit. Finally, we have a bonus section which just summarizes related practice makes perfect. I'm going to be sort of going over maybe a couple tips and tricks, things to keep in mind when you're making garments, but this is overall the guide and sort of our agenda for today. First, supplies. Now, I talked about how having, of course, yarn and your crochet hooks is going to be imperative, but also just a couple extra accessories and things. Things maybe that I've went over before and that you will see no matter what you're making, but I just want to kind of highlight them. So one in particular is your tapestry needles. There's come in different shapes and sizes, so it is important also to sort of know what works for you. And those are going to be important because obviously if you don't weave in your ends, then they're just going to be hanging all around and your piece is just not going to look as good as what you probably imagined in your head it to look, right? Or that piece maybe that you saw a picture of and you're like, you bought the pattern or got the pattern and you made it and you're like, this just doesn't look the same. Make sure you're weaving in those ends. Next up, we have scissors. Now, I did include sort of a picture, and the reason I wanted to include a picture is because when I think of scissors, I think just a simple pair of craft scissors, and I know that like there's people have different definitions of it. When I say scissors, I mean some scissors like this, not too big, not too small, just scissors that you can sort of keep around to cut the yarn any given point in time. There's also what is noted as like yarn scissors, which kind of look like shears, sort of. And those can be nice. They're more compacted. They do essentially the same thing. I kind of don't like them because you have to kind of cut it a certain way, and I don't know, it's just kind of weird for me. But the MVP, I feel like, of this whole conversation is going to be a soft tape measure. I say soft in particular because, in general, soft tape measures are used in the real world for like measuring um, and doing alterations and things, and it's perfect because it can like wrap around, like if you need to measure your torso or your arms or whatever. If you don't have a soft tape measure, though, you can still use other things, like for instance, a piece of yarn or thread, and then you can just like measure over whatever you're trying to do, and then using, like, let's say you have a ruler, you can use that over that, and you'll still get the same measurements. I just think it's much more convenient using a soft tape measure. You can usually get them pretty inexpensively, but again, that's just a little tip if maybe you can't get your hands on one at this exact point in juncture. Next up is technique. So I briefly mentioned the fundamental stitches. Really and truly, any garment is, when you make any garment, you're essentially making the fabric and then using a join method to join the fabric in a way to get the desired clothing in this case, or that you want to achieve. So for instance, if you're making a sweater, you're just making the fabric for it in the shape that you want it, and then attaching different pieces of that fabric so that you can get it to look like a sweater. So you could, that being said, you can use any stitch to make the fabric. So whether that be single crochet, double crochet, half double, or some iteration of these stitches combined. Next would be assembly. So I did mention joining. I'd recommend when going into this knowing at least one join method. Really and truly, most of them are not that hard. The most common one that I've seen is the whip stitch because it is so easy, but even easier, honestly, would be like just slip stitching pieces together. It might not give you as aesthetically pleasing of a look, the seam, as maybe something like a mattress stitch, which is for you to get more of like an invisible look, but really you just need to know a way to get one piece attached to another piece and have it not look super weird. The choice of join method is really going to depend on your desired look. Then you have finishing touches. So this is where that blocking comes in handy, which just like a lot of things we've talked about, like the join methods, for instance, there's a lot of different ways that you can block that really depend on like your yarn type. A lot of it is personal preference, but essentially, let's say a common method is wet blocking, where you'd wet the piece and then you kind of wring out a little bit, not wring it, but like sort of press off the water, and then you'd shape it by pinning it or just kind of adjusting it to how you want, and then it's going to dry, and when it dries, then it'll be a little more of your desired. And so oftentimes for things like, for instance, if you want it like a little bit more stretched, or maybe the drape isn't that good when it's not blocked, so then you block it and then it just has like a better overall feel. It makes it feel more like a garment. It's kind of hard for me to describe it because I'm not like I'm not like a super expert on blocking, but that's the best way that I could describe it. Next up is patterns. When we talked about the what, I did mention that, you could go the freehand route, which is not necessarily something I would recommend for beginners, or you could go the pattern route, which I feel like all of us have at one point done that, whether we were like very starting, like honestly throughout your whole journey, you're probably going to always use patterns because people are so creative and they come up with such amazing designs, and it's like, oh, I want to make that. So I decided that I would list just a couple means or sites for you to get patterns. So of course we have the free pattern route, which I want to note that most of these, they, like for instance, the ones I'm going to list in free patterns, they have more than just the free patterns. They probably also have the paid patterns. But first up we have Ravelry, which is a community-based site, and different people who are on the site will upload their own designs, and a lot of the times you can catch really cute designs that are free. Then we have something that I'm maybe a little less versed with, but the site Hobby, they also will have designs that are there, and you can find a lot of really nice free ones. Then we have sites that are known for paid patterns. So we have Etsy, of course, which you probably know about. And in general, also, I want to note that even though we have free and paid, most of the times paid patterns are pretty inexpensive, which is nice. So even if you do have to pay for a pattern, um, I don't think you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, like I'm having to spend so much money. They're pretty inexpensive. But we have Etsy, and then when I say social media, I do obviously have a picture of Instagram, but there's different. That's probably I feel like the biggest one where you'll find patterns. And when I say patterns, sometimes people will legitimately have like, oh, here's how you make it. But this is a good way, I feel like, if you want to sort of put certain creators on your radar, and then from there you can go to like their personal websites, or maybe they might have an Etsy page, or link you to the Ravelry. I think it's a good way to sort of, like as the name suggests, like network socially to find creators that you really like their stuff, and then you can go and support them. Now we're going to go into talking about measurements. I would like to preface this by saying I am no way, shape, or form an expert, and all of my advice comes from personal experience as well as research. So I included this picture and diagram, and you can, if you want to, like pause it, read through it. I feel like it does a pretty good job of generally telling and explaining to you like how you make the measurements. But I'm going to go over the general stuff. So one would be width, which is going to be your shoulders. And when you're measuring it, I would go from one edge of your shoulder to the other shoulder. Then you have bust, which there are different like portions of your bust that you can also measure, but the most general part is just going to be take your widest part of your chest, and that's where you're going to measure around. Then there's waist, which is going to be closer to your torso, and that's going to be the smallest part of your waist. For your hips, that's going to be the largest part of your hips. For arms, you're just going to go around, I would say, the largest portion of your arm and measure that. Then for the actual, like, for instance, length, you would go from the edge of your shoulder to your desired length. And then, what is it called? Yeah, so those are those. I repeated, but it's the same thing. And I feel like this is less intuitive now from just like a conversational perspective. It's like, oh, okay, but I think it'll make more sense once you actually just like try making your first garment. And so, for instance, when I'm freehanding, these are all very important measurements, because then you can sort of go into being like, okay, I have this foundational chain. What does the foundational chain represent? It's most likely like the width of your shoulders. And then from there, like once you know, like you seam up the sides and you're going into doing the sleeves, from whatever that point stops to down to wherever I want it to stop, like things like that. So I am explaining it to you just because I want, whenever you're going to making garments, I don't want it to be like you're drawing a blank on all the things that are being included. But it is something that as you make more and more garments, you're going to be a little bit more, it's going to be a little bit more intuitive than it probably is right now if you're just starting and getting into that world. Overall, these measurements are going to just be used as a general framework for figuring out how you want your garment to fit. But as you obviously like learn more about how you like things to fit, so if you want it tighter, you might like subtract a couple inches or centimeters off of your measurement, or if you want it baggier, you might make it bigger. So use these as sort of as a general framework. Don't necessarily think of it as, oh, these are the measurements, I can't go outside of those. Have fun with it. So now the bonus section that I was talking about, where I'm just going to give some additional tips. So one is practice. It is a good idea, I recommend, to not jump straight into garments. There are some people who do that, and you might have success yourself. I just don't particularly think that I recommend it, because one, garments can take a little bit longer. It really depends on the kind of garment, but like when I think of a garment, I feel like a lot of people immediately in their head, they think of like a sweater or something like that. It takes more time than, let's say, like a beginner project that I went over before. Like, you know what I'm saying? Girls are going to be smaller, whereas a garment can be kind of big comparatively. So make sure you have other garments or other projects under your belt. Some other ideas would be things like dishcloths, scarves, headbands. And of course, you can check out my video that I did on like what I consider the top 10 beginner crochet projects. And that'll, like, if you go down that line of the list, by the time you're like, let's say you dedicate yourself to like making each and every one of them, by the time you finish making the last one, you will 100% be ready, because you have ran into most of the issues or challenges that you are going to run into if you're making garments. Another thing is stretch and drape. When I was first getting into making, like for instance, when I made my first pair of shorts, I didn't necessarily consider things like that the yarn over time will stretch. And so I made it and I was like, okay, cool. And it was too big because I didn't think about the fact that it's going to stretch as you wear it. So just be sure to take that in consideration. Different yarn is going to also react differently. So if you're making something with cotton, it's probably not going to stretch as much as, let's say, an acrylic yarn. And so that will also play a role into your mindset and like how you tackle making them. Again, don't be intimidated by that though, because with practice, you're going to it's going to become an intuitive thing, taking these things into account. So now we're up to the last portion of the video. We sort of went over a general framework of making and creating garments. I kind of went over the supplies you would need, sources that I think would be good if you're trying to look for patterns and to see what kind of garments you might want to make. I gave you additional tips. I covered just the general broad sort of crash course in measurements and body measurements that I think are notable. And that is essentially going to be it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.